Hi, this is Joseph.
Hi, this is Isaac.
Hi, Isaac. We are starting the second episode of the Iron Rod podcast.
It's a pleasure, Joseph, and it's a pleasure also to be heard by everyone who is still with us.
Thank you for that as well.
Let tyrants shake their iron rod, and slavery clank her galling chain. We fear them not, we trust in God. New England's God forever reign.
Today the theme will be Napoleon, life and times, because of our angle of an approach of the Iron Rod, we'll be discussing his tyranny, but we will generally talk about Napoleon. In general, we will take a thematic approach to Napoleon, and today our book review, our movie recommendation, our quote, and our myth busting. These are some of the ideas we discussed in our first episode that we might be doing in the podcast in general. All those things will involve Napoleon. Napoleon comes into France in late 19th century,
18th century.
late 18th century, early 19th century. Thank you, Isaac. France, important to get that exactly right. So late 1700s, early 1800s. Before I give it over to Isaac, let me just say that France, before Napoleon, had a revolution. Before the revolution, they had a king. So France was controlled by nobles for a very, very, very long time.
Or rather by a king, and then it was controlled by the king.
Then, right, nobles and then a king, right. But by these higher orders of people, which had many turns and roundabouts for a millennia perhaps, but that all came very rapidly to an end in 1789, and it culminated in the French Revolution. Now, the king wasn't necessarily opposed from the first moment that the revolution began in 89, and maybe Isaac will tell us a little bit about the deposition of the king, and then tell us a little bit about the revolution and the things that the revolution spawned. The revolution created the Reign of Terror, it created all sorts of craziness that swept through France, it created the Napoleonic Wars, which we'll also discuss a little bit, and it created Napoleon himself, a product, effect, and almost also a cause of the revolution. So, take it away. The king starts losing his power in 1789. What happens next that we want to tell the audience, Isaac?
Well, at 1789, the king is kind of in a pickle, which he didn't want to be. His grandfather, Louis XIV, actually his great-grandfather, Louis XIV, started a process by which he took a kingdom which initially was not that different from its northern neighbor England. It had a king, yes, but it had a powerful aristocracy, a very opinionated gentry, somewhat vocal bourgeoisie, and of course a very, very, very rich and very, very powerful clergy, which all could pose their grievances and wishes and general low opinion of the men in Paris through various regional parliaments. By the way, parliaments in France don't mean what they mean in England. First of all, there are many of them. Second of all, they are more judicial institutions, or local assemblies of noblemen, or ecclesiastical synod, etc. Now, Louis does that. Louis doesn't like it because when he is a kid and he becomes king at a very young age, there's a aristocratic revolt against him, or rather against the prime minister and probably secret lover and husband of his mother, Anne of Austria, Cardinal Mazarin. The revolt fails, but he never forgets it, so he starts a 50 years project of centralizing power. And at the end of it, the kingdom is not in good shape. The kingdom is not in a very good shape at all, because the centralization through the court, by which he basically forced every nobleman in the kingdom spend ridiculous amounts of money in Versailles, and time, of course, really robs the countryside of its natural leadership, and it's costing the kingdom a lot of money, and the king himself, and the kingdom is in a very bad shape, and it's going south from there. As a matter of fact, France went into at least 4 wars in the 18th century alone against England. They didn't win one of them.
That's a bad record.
That's a very bad record, and that's, by the way, why to this day the French have a bad military popular reputation, despite their military being one of the best on earth historically, and by absolute measures too. So the king. So
I think for our American audience, which is our audience, people would know then the 7 Years' War, which is one of these wars. That you mentioned, right?
Also in America is the French and Indian War.
French and Indian Wars in the United States,
Which
we mentioned,
which General Washington kind of started by accidentally by shooting at the French outpost, but that's besides the point. So he found himself without any money. Not a very enviable position for a French king or any king. As a matter of fact, his cousin twice removed, Charles I, when he was in this position, started a whole thing that ended up losing himself his crown, his head, and eventually his entire dynasty. So, yeah.
Charles is the cousins with King Louis XIV, the Sun King that we're talking about.
Yes, exactly.
The great-grandfather of the current king of the Napoleonic era, who is Louis XVI.
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
But the King of France can't just do whatever he wants. He's more powerful than the King of England in that there is a tax that goes directly to his pocket. That's called the tail. It's a remnant from the 100 Years' War by which he taxes. It's a poll tax, which means every Frenchman basically pays a certain amount of money to exist. And
nice work if you can get it.
Yes. But it's not enough. Imagine that. The most fertile and populous country in Europe, possibly the world, disregarding China, because everybody disregards China in Europe. It's in the late 18th century, everyone there have to pay you a certain amount of money every day of the year, and it's not enough for you. What do? You go to the Estates General. What's the Estates General? That's the 3 estates of the kingdom: the clergy, the nobility, and the bourgeoisie, all coming together in some sort of a legislative assembly and passing taxation legislation. There's a problem. Nobody assembled the Estates General since the 17th century, since his great grandfather Henri IV, Henry IV of Navarre, the founder of the Bourbon dynasty, the man who wrestles control from the Valois dynasty, assembled them to make himself officially, legitimately the king. That's how. And so nobody is sure what the procedure is. So they come in. The king tried to push in just taxation, but the third estate have more demands. They are quite angry that the noblemen don't pay any taxes. Oh yeah, I forgot to tell you, noblemen don't pay taxes in the Kingdom of France. Oh, no, neither does the clergy, because the clergy are technically, or as they call the first estate, that's the king's estate, because the king is technically a clergyman by the Constitution of France. Does
France at this point in time have a written or unwritten constitution?
Unwritten constitution. Well, it's written, but it's written in so many law codes, regional law codes, that it's in Parisian law that it's just that might as well not be written. But that's the understanding. The king and the clergymen are on the same footing. They belong to the same estate. The noblemen are the second estate. Neither of these estates pay any taxes unless they want to. And guess what? Apparently they don't. And the third estate, the bourgeoisie and everybody else, the peasants don't count, by the way. The peasants are just peasants. They pay all the taxes if they like it or not. And of course they have all sorts of other weird duties like building castles, even though nobody really built castles for defense anymore. So now peasants get drafted to build basically pleasure houses for the nobility, and very nasty stuff.
Interesting regression. Of,
yes,
the enfeeblement of civilization. So you have the three estates, and the bourgeoisie are not directly connected to the peasants. Are they in fact representing them, or are they consider?
Well,
their
they
interests
see themselves.
misaligned?
They see some connection between themselves and the peasants. You see, the bourgeoisie in France is a very interesting point because it combines, you might say, of two archetypical people. There are the people who are trying to become noblemen, mostly lawyers, because in France you can become a nobleman by two. There are two ways to become a nobleman. One is to live 3 generations like a nobleman, which means to serve in the army in the as an officer, and to lead a certain lifestyle, which is very expensive. So then you are a nobleman, but you are not titled. You are not necessarily the Baron of X or the Count of Y just because you are a nobleman. So people will call you the Sir of X or Y. So
That is the first way to.
that's the first way to become a nobleman. Of course, you can just be ennobled by the king, but you can just be ennobled by the king.
So you need to do something special or have connections for that. I imagine.
Exactly. And the other way, that was how do you join the nobility of the sword. The other way was, if you are a lawyer, and if you are a very good lawyer, and you serve the king as an advocate or a judge or anything like that, or as a civil servant, that confers upon you a certain amount of nobility. So you consider to be, as a matter of courtesy, because you serve the king, you consider to be a nobleman. You the nobility of this, those people called the nobility of the robe. Those people, the nobility of the sword look down on them. Yeah, because the nobility of the sword is mostly people who were serving the king on campaigns, shedding their blood, or at least the peasants' blood. What's the difference? For centuries at this point. Some of them trace their lineage all the way to Charlemagne. Of course, you know, parchment is cheap, but you can. But and they have all those elaborate escutons and coat of arms that every dot and splash and claw in it have hidden meaning, hidden esoteric meaning. You don't want to know. It's complicated. It's complicated, but technically you are a nobleman. You are a judge. You are nobility of the robe. You don't pay taxes. So
in our unfolding saga, it's about to become very unpleasant to be a nobleman. So what happens next?
So then, that's one part. The other part are the people who are bourgeoisie, but they didn't forget that the bourgeoisie always comes from the peasantry. Because in medieval Europe, a peasant that don't like to be very much to be a peasant, not to mention a serf, he goes to the city, he runs to the city, makes sure his lord doesn't find him for a year and a day, and he's free. And once he's free, he starts as a workman, then he saves some money, he opens a shop, he's a bourgeoisie. Eventually, his descendants will be the mayors of Paris or something along these lines. So some bourgeoisie don't forget that they were peasants once, and some bourgeoisie, they might have forgot that they were peasants. But what they don't forget is the way that the way the nobility treats them, and more than that, they don't forget that the king is not really on their side, because it's the king who taxed them. Yes, they are angry that the nobility enjoy all the good stuff that they produce and sell in the city, and don't pay any taxes, but they are more cross with the king who takes those taxes from them. And the thing is, the nobility is also not fully with the king, because the king actually wants to tax the nobility, and
as a way to squeeze out more money, because the king felt he was in dire straits.
Absolutely,
especially
after the American Revolution, which he supported. And now that we mentioned the American Revolution, all those young Frenchmen, mostly noblemen, come back to France, to this absolutist, most Catholic kingdom in Europe. And by the way, most Catholic, I don't mean that it was most Catholic, that was literally the title of the King of France, His Most Catholic Majesty. And the
truth in advertisement, huh?
Yes, I know. They just help a Protestant libertarian republic rise. Okay, maybe libertarian is stretching it, but
definitely
in the
very radically different
in the concept of the time, based on, and their head is full with the images of Washington and Adams and the other Adams.
So are you leading that some of these young military officers, many of them nobles themselves, are now going to be trying to
Absolutely.
change the
Absolutely.
regime.
Marquis de Lafayette is one of them, and they all want, and so
He's famous for being associated with Washington and being involved in the Yorktown battle.
and also been involved in the Revolutionary War. He's the first leader of the National Guard, which the Estates General, let's not get too early. The Estates General decides that
State General, that means all three estates combined.
all three estates combined. So enough noblemen and clergymen join the third estate
Interesting.
delegates so they declare themselves to be not the third estate, not the delegates of the third estate inside the Estate General. They declare themselves to be the Unified National Assembly of France. And now that's a constitutional power to reckon with. And they started this, and immediately the nobleman says, "We give up our noble privileges. We give up even our coat of arms. There should be no difference between free citizens of France."
And some of the nobles are in fact selflessly saying this, or at least foolishly saying this. They're willing to surrender. I'm not sure if they know what they're signing up for. They had no idea.
Oh, absolutely, they have no idea. And immediately, of course,
but they have this sort of fantastical notion of elevating the rest of the country at their own expense to some extent. Is that what you're saying?
yes, they want to elevate. They want everyone to enjoy their privileges. They want all Frenchmen to enjoy the privilege of no taxation without consent. Which, by the way, here in the English-speaking world, we take for granted. Our revolution was fought mainly on this basis. So, and immediately they raise a force in case the Swiss guard of King Louis. Oh, by the way, King Louis have a Swiss guard just like the Pope, and his Swiss guard probably predates the Pope's.
These are mercenaries dating back from an earlier time when the Swiss were perhaps the strongest force in Europe.
Yeah, and they're
one of the strongest.
And they're pretty fierce themselves. They're still pretty fierce force. So they raised the National Guard. The National Guard is a group of French citizens who stormed the Bastille earlier, took some took the weapons from the arsenal inside.
So what is the Bastille? Give us
the Bastille is basically the fortress prison that the kings of France send people there, and sometimes without trial. Yes, it just so happened that when they stormed the Bastille, all they found were common criminals, but the principle stands. The principle stands that for generations, the kings of France sent the people they just didn't like very much. By the way, the term
you're making a symbolic point, even though the Bastille was basically empty.
Yes.
And there were some maniacs there and lunatics.
Lunatics.
Counterfeiter or something?
Yeah, a counterfeiter or two, yes. who were all very confused when all those revolutionaries step up and drape them in ribbons of liberty, etc.
So to use a Wellington term, this which happened very soon after the Estates General gathered, which you mentioned, happens in 1789.
Yes.
This is right at the beginning. And what happens next?
Oh, what happens next is these various political...
many things happen next. What happens next that you think we have to know?
Various political machinations, but among other things, all the powers of Europe, all the monarchical powers of Europe, which means the entirety of Europe, declares war on France. Everybody declares war on France, and then the king decided that he would pull the same trick that his great-great-grandmother pulled when she tried Anne of Austria, when she fled with her little son Louis XIV out of Paris, because he think, if I can get out of Paris, I can assemble an army and reconquer Paris.
So he was in Paris, not exactly under house arrest, but kind of being babysat there by the mob.
Let's call it he was under the watchful eye of the least savory part of the and yes, he's trying, but he's getting arrested because.
So he gets caught on his estate.
He's getting caught. Not a very good position, and the National Assembly is now trying him. So they try him, and he's put to death. He's executed. By the way, the deciding vote on the execution is his cousin, the Duke of Orleans.
Oh.
Because
really the nobility nobility kind of undermining itself.
Oh no, Duke of Orleans actually have a very cold calculation to make, because you think if the line of Louis gets extinct, his line is next in line, and he makes the calculation. Okay, all this revolution business will go away very soon, and they'll figure out, okay, we need a king, so I'm next in line because the Duke of Orleans is of the royal house. He's a prince of the blood. So.
And this happened. He is executed in the beginning of 93. So other events took place.
So they immediately, we don't have a king anymore. What do we do? How do we order things? So, because the constitutional monarchy we thought we will have, well, that just flew out of the window.
So there was some sort of dream among some members of the assembly to have a constitutional monarchy.
Yes.
And that was...
They were the Girondins.
That was definitely sabotaged when he attempted to escape, because he strengthened the hand of the radicals who did not want a constitutional monarchy.
Yes.
By him attempting to escape. So I'm sorry, to go on.
So then they passed the Constitution of 1793, also known as Year One, because as a very wise man said, history begins in 1776. Everything before it was a mistake. They have the similar attitude towards the moment when they executed the king. Everything before Year One was a mistake, and they passed the Constitution of 1793. To be short, the point of the Constitution is that the National Assembly is in the center of everything. Every Frenchman, and with by the way, with emphasis on men. Women are chattel in France.
This is pre-revolution and during revolution.
Yeah, absolutely. And okay, not necessarily chattel, but they essentially property. All Frenchmen above 21 have the vote. They all vote to the National Assembly and to the electoral assemblies. The electoral assemblies elect local civil servants and judges, but the National Assembly appoints from among the local civil servants. They appoint the executive committee, and they also keep a very close watch over the judges, especially the members of the Cour de Cassation. The Cassation, or the High Court of Appeals, which is controlled very tightly by the National Assembly. The National Assembly essentially is the government. That's the Constitution of 1793. And this concludes part 1 of this discussion. We'll be back in a minute.
Hi, this is Joseph with Isaac. We are in the second segment of episode 2 of the Iron Rod podcast. And we just discussed briefly about how the French Revolution, which began with the estates assembled and with the storming of Bastille in 89. This is 1789. And we got from there to the execution of the King of France in 93. Even prior to the execution, his very imprisonment and threat had begun the war, Austrian and France fighting, but as Isaac mentioned, it would truly be a European war because all the monarchs of Europe, which basically means all of Europe more or less, or at least all the important players in Europe, are now going to be waging war against France.
The only important power in Europe which is not a monarchy is the Netherlands, and even they are at this point kind of a monarchy.
Yes, and soon the Netherlands would then find itself under the clutches of the French Republic. So between the execution of 1793, until Napoleon basically becomes Supremo of France, let's give it at approximately 1800. In that time, there are various governments of France. We're not going to go through all of them, but we'll just briefly say that one of the most significant is the Jacobins, which Isaac will talk about. Then, by way of introduction, throughout this entire period of the revolution into the fall of Napoleon, there are people who are trying to resurrect the monarchy, and those are called royalists. They're trying to do conspiracies and plots and revolutions and so on.
There are also the moderates who are called the Girondins.
And the different factions are moving, different ways. And sometimes the moderates
It's
are
very
with the royalists.
it's very much Judea Liberation Front versus Free Judea Front thing.
So much is the terror of the people against the Jacobins. So people are so fearful, with good cause, that when there was a failed assassination attempt against Napoleon, and he was almost killed, and 13 people were killed near him when some sort of bomb went off near his carriage. Even though it was a royalist plot that did it, he immediately blamed the Jacobins and used it to further suppress them. So this is why I think that although there were various governments, which we're not going to go into the nitty-gritty because there is a lot of nitty-gritty to avoid in this, but what are the Jacobins? Why are they so fearful? Why is everyone so fearful of them? Why are they so fearsome? Why are they so bloody?
Well, the Jacobin ideology, in as much as we can say that there was a Jacobin ideology, they didn't have a Hitler or Stalin to write them a full tract and then lead them. It was more of an ad hoc thing, but the idea, basically, those were people who were obsessed with reason and rationality and with unity, national unity to be precise. So basically, it means that the entire nation of France should be conducted along a central plan, and nobody is allowed to deviate. So basically, imagine the first totalitarians. And the central to the idea is that vice disrupts reason, and basically everyone who... So therefore, since the central plan for France is based on reason, everybody who opposes it must be doing it out of vice, out of his vicious character. So therefore, he must be destroyed, because you can't... And virtue is just to behave according to reason is virtuous. And a virtuous man is the man who never deviates from reason, or in other words, never deviates from the plan. You see where this is going, right?
Yes, I think they take the word planned economy and planned society to the next level. So this sort of philosophy, if we can call it that, what is that? What are some of the tangible manifestations of it?
Well, tangible manifestation number one. So France beforehand had a lot of codes of laws along regional lines. Louis XIV tried, to a great success, I would say, to eliminate some of the regional differences between his subjects, but he didn't take it far away enough to the taste of the Jacobins. It's funny, but the Jacobins were the most ardent opposition to the monarchy, were actually continuing a royal project of centralizing France. So they eliminate local laws. They want to break down every kind of social structure, any kind of local hierarchy. The only hierarchy that should exist, in their opinion, is the hierarchy between the central government, sitting in Paris, the National Assembly, the one who represents the genius of the French people, and all the different Frenchmen, who must all be the same. Not in matter of social standing, not necessarily matter of wealth. There is some argument among the Jacobins about that, but in matter of social standing, of legal status, everybody must be the same, and everybody stands directly under the national government of France.
And as far as social standing is concerned, is it correct would they refer to each other as citizen? That was part
citizens, not even Mr. or Monsieur, which was a long time practice, which have of politeness, which basically even common Frenchmen treated it, deferred to each other as if they were noblemen, because Monsieur, of course, means Monsieur, which is more equivalent to my lord than to Mr., which of course comes from master, which is a bourgeoisie term. So,
the leader of these gentlemen, who was very big on a particular type of execution method, or at least very associated with that, and would later himself get his just desserts. He was named Robespierre. What sort of interesting things do we need to know about him, and was he the most significant figure of this Jacobins?
Well, he was as perfect a Jacobin as you can find. Very impassionate when speaking about reason, very unemotional speaking about anything else. Lifelong bachelor, and no, he was not a
homosexual.
He was not homosexual. No, he was just not. There was not room in his life for anything. He's lifelong bachelor, and a lawyer. Grew up Protestant, interestingly enough, and he was called the Incorruptible. Lived in a tiny apartment in Paris. Throughout his own basic rule of his rule over the Republic, and he never took a bribe.
Of France lived in poverty. In other words.
He himself lived in relative poverty. He was not. He was a very elegant dresser, but his clothes were never too expensive. They were always clean. His wig was always powdered. And he always dressed immaculately. But that's it. That's as far as it goes. And he was famous orator. He spoke. You can say that he was the great. About his oratory, you could say he was grandfather to Hitler and Mussolini in his speaking style. Say what you will about his politics.
Speaking of his politics, so the guillotine had been invented earlier and had been used by the previous governments, but I think he kind of made it famous that he would do that to his enemies.
Oh yes, as a matter of fact, the term. As a matter of fact, the revolutionaries started to call affectionately the guillotine affectionately Madame la Guillotine, which is funny because at that point there was the only women which were addressed as Madame were being guillotined. All the women, good French Republican women called each other and were called citoyenne such and such, citoyenne X, or citizeness. As we would say it in English,
the female
form of citizen, yes, and and Robespierre is heading something called the Committee of Public Safety. So we established that France is at war on all fronts. So therefore, the National Assembly established inside of itself a committee called the Committee for Public Safety. That's
It seems like a very Orwellian term, in part because it was pretty unsafe to me for many of the citizens in France.
Yes.
And in fact, funnily enough, it comes from the United States, although it has much less of an ominous overtone.
Yes, and in the United States there were multiple committees of public safety.
In France, there was but one.
Yes, exactly.
There was the committee in charge of the entire country, but Robespierre was calling the shots.
And essentially, this committee comes to govern the entire country by its own. The National Assembly becomes the Constitution becomes a dead letter, and the National Assembly becomes an increasingly dead body.
Did they change the Constitution?
No, they don't need to. They don't need to. Officially, the Constitution is still there. Don't worry. None of your freedoms we're suspended to the duration of the emergency.
A temporary emergency. So nothing as permanent as a temporary emergency.
Yes, it's and of course this temporary emergency get lengthening. And look, I don't think it was cynical because France really was on war with the entirety of Europe. That's a good deal of emergency. But the thing is, then they say what is the grand project is so military operations are largely left to the generals who try their best to get as far away from Paris as possible because most of them are actually aristocrats. And
it's safer. But it's also unsafe to be a general because
if you are too popular.
If you're too popular, but even if you show any sort of initiative and you lose, you can be executed or punished. So
because of course,
later tendency to ride back to Paris for strict instructions before making any sort of march. That way you could blame them.
And you could imagine why why the war is not going very well, which is applied with the Committee of Public Safety with ample excuses to say, oh, the country is full of spies, aristocratic spies, and we must, and for the good of the motherland, of the nation, of reason, of virtue, you must kill them all. And of course, eventually, and then they say, oh, no, there are traitors even inside the National Assembly. And I mentioned how the National Assembly becomes essentially a dead body in the sense that that more and more of the members are becoming dead bodies.
Yes, they really got the point, or
yes.
The point of the guillotine.
Well, the guillotine doesn't really have a point. It's more.
More
yes, of course.
A blade, yes. Eventually, though, ironically, I mean, even though it was a dead body, Robespierre was overthrown by that body. I think one of his friends got up to speak, and this was a conspiracy, long time coming to overthrow him.
Absolutely, largely inside his own committee, which came to fruition when he executed one of the members of this very same committee, Danton, who was one of the original revolutionaries,
and who was very popular amongst wide swaths of the.
All of a sudden, everybody in the committee itself start feeling a little itch around the back of their heads.
Yeah, so one interesting thing that did come from Robespierre was that his brother was friends with Napoleon.
Oh yes,
and that partially may ensure Napoleon's success as a general. Having good political connections was very significant.
And very early on, Napoleon is sent to his native island of Corsica to hunt down unsavory elements of the population in the name of the Committee of Public Safety, the National Assembly. So
he's also at one point said, and that didn't go well. He's also at one point said there is one province of France that's very royalist and very Catholic, where much of the greatest barbarities happen. Maybe you could talk about that for a moment.
Oh, that's the Vendée, or as we might, which is basically at the base of Brittany, and it's a very mountainous region. Not exactly French, as a matter of fact. It's mostly Celtic, in language and in customs, and even though they speak a form of French, they have their own language and their own customs, and they are very, very loyal to the aristocratic leaders and to the king. In the abstract, they had their fair share of revolts against the king in the past, but in the abstract, they're loyal to the king. And so they rebel against the National Assembly, and unpleasantries ensue. Let's leave it at that.
All right. So obviously, although we don't bill ourselves as a family show, we try not to make certain types of comments that would offend the sensibilities. But just to, I think, do justice and translate the horrors that was taking place there, there were simply put, people being executed by some people like Joseph Fouché, who later became very significant as the chief of staff for Napoleon.
Chief of police
for Napoleon and for the Directory, and even offered the job by the King of France when he returns. So definitely very bizarre, interesting character who trained as a priest, though he betrayed his Christianity as well. So he's going around blowing people up with cannons.
Oh, and he does such a great job that they send him to reduce the royal city of Lyon, by the way, which was the financial center of France at the time, and he does such a thorough job of killing people with grape shot, and by the way, grape shot have nothing to do with grapes. It's very, very less. It's much less pleasant. It's okay. I assume that a lot of you are eating while you're listening to this, so I'll spare you the details.
Maybe later in this podcast,
basically,
or another podcast, we'll discuss the weapons of the revolution. We'll discuss what.
Absolutely, but he leaves a plaque after him. Not much else besides the plaque, and the plaque says, "Lyon rebels against the Republic. Lyon is no more."
Wow, very ominous. So that's for sure. But one person who does not, who almost deserts and is possibly house arrested, though there is still controversy today as to what happened, is Napoleon.
Absolutely.
He doesn't want to go, in part, not necessarily because he doesn't have the stomach to put down the revolution, but he realizes that's not the right thing to do to advance his career, or at least he doesn't want to be associated with this sort of madness. So
he's starting to smell the end of the terror, because at this point the Committee of Public Safety is attacked on both sides of the political aisle. Secretly, grumblingly. People are very attached to their heads, remember? So from the left, it's what we want. We want bread and the Constitution of 1793. From the right, they call to let's finish the revolution. Let's establish a stable government in France. And stable government means government that's not based on a national assembly that can produce a committee of public safety that cuts off the heads of significant amount of the sections of the populations.
All right. So speaking of which, now in the end of 1794, and we come to the execution of Robespierre, and the end of this committee and beginning of a different government, which eventually becomes the Directory. So now that Napoleon is bursting through the scene, although we mentioned him before, let me now give a brief introduction, a brief summary rather, of Napoleon's career and how he comes onto the picture. So early on, while the Robespierre and his brother, who was friends with Napoleon, was still in power, Napoleon was very significant as head of artillery in 93 in the siege of Toulon, which was very significant. Napoleon himself fought in that battle, getting wounded in the thigh with a bayonet at one point. This is not a big deal. Many of Napoleon's marshals, we will discuss later, Napoleon's best generals are called his marshals, are wounded 20, 30, 40 times apiece. So being wounded once or twice is not considered something to cry home about. But in this point and the earlier campaigns we will discuss, Napoleon actually does have to sometimes get in the thick of fighting. Pretty soon, Napoleon finds himself the most significant man in France because the government that replaces Robespierre is about to fall. The royalists are in the street to the tune of tens of thousands of them.
20,000 as a matter of fact.
20,000 of them. And Napoleon is asked to suppress the revolt. Napoleon understands the significance of using cannon. He uses the whiff of grape shot, which you mentioned. Grape shot is very, very, very briefly turns the cannon into a giant shotgun by putting a lot of little musket balls or other types of things inside the cannon.
You can imagine
it's an anti-personnel weapon.
Absolutely.
So Napoleon had seen how the Swiss Guard had been massacred defending the King of France, and they did not have cannon. So I think that was his best lesson that he learned from that.
Yeah.
He puts down the revolt and now becomes indispensable. France is fighting a multi-front war against various European countries.
Which actually starts to go well. Pichegru crosses the Val and conquers Switzerland. It turns into a republic. By the way, it's still called the Helvetian Confederation, which is the old name that he gave it to. Actually, it was a republic before that, but that republic was icky because it was like 500 years old. So of course they have to change it. And
right, so they're reinventing the wheel,
yes,
teaching democracy to the Democrats,
to the Swiss, yes. And the Netherlands fall to the French, and things start to go well. One area that doesn't go well is Italy, or not exactly Italy because they can't cross the Alps. They can't even cross the rivers that before the Alps.
Yes, and eventually Napoleon, by using some cunning, manages to get the Directory to send him to Italy, first as chief of staff and later as the commanding general. And he's fighting chiefly against the Austrians at this point.
And this is by the way, the least funded, worst dressed, with the army with the worst recruits.
Right. As we look at the overall Napoleonic Wars, the wars that Napoleon himself is involved in, from let's say, although he's there earlier, but let's say from 96 till 1815, Battle of Waterloo, when Napoleon is defeated for the last time. As time goes on, his army is better disciplined, better fed, clothed, armed, and so on. So his earlier victories are so much more impressive. He's doing this with all sorts of limitations.
Yes.
Until he becomes.
As a matter of fact, he's given this army mostly to keep him outside of Paris because one of the directors, Marat, is sleeping with his wife.
That's uncomfortable.
Or fiancée at this point, Josephine. I think
Josephine.
Josephine and he were just betrothed. No, I think they were married at this point. Yeah, he married her very quickly, and he doesn't know that. And Marat and Josephine would rather him not be knowing it because Bonaparte is a hot-tempered, not Corsican. That's something that he never shook from his early upbringing. He's a hot-tempered man, and he doesn't like the idea of his wife sleeping with another man more than anybody else. So,
well, what is very shocking for this time, I think, is that he ends up divorcing Josephine, and then he marries for political advantage
an Austrian princess.
Yes.
So you can see how.
But that's into the future. But right now he's fighting against the Austrians. He fights them in northern Italy, very successfully. They sometimes bring to bear 2 or 3 times the amount of soldiers he has in the battlefield, but by using very careful maneuver, he's able to win very successfully. but he never has enough troops to win decisively enough that he's able to get the Austrians to clear the field. So he's doing this in 1796. He's fighting the Austrians in 1777, and at the end of 1977, in 1797 rather, there's a treaty between France and Austria. Napoleon is planning his next move. So I'm going to take the Chandler view on this. Chandler says that Napoleon actually himself wanted to quit France. He realized that the government, which is now under the Directory, is vastly unpopular in the entire country of France.
Mostly because they limited the franchise. From now on, only male adult taxpayers can vote. Beforehand, every Frenchman can vote.
Interesting. So that's one of the things, and I'm sure, they're not winning the war as decisively enough or fast enough to be popular. So he embarks on his Oriental adventure. He seizes Malta. He's there for a few days on the way to Egypt.
Yes.
So he's in Egypt in 1798. By the way, I'm reading a timeline, and this is our book recommendation for today, from A Military History and Atlas of the Napoleonic Wars. One of the authors is Brigadier General Esposito. This is our book recommendation. It is the official atlas used in West Point. So if you're able to pick that up, I would highly recommend that. And Napoleon goes to Egypt. He wins decisively against the Mamluks, which are these bizarre, maybe for another show, bizarre, I think, European slaves who managed to install themselves as head of the
Muslim European slaves,
head of the
or
Egyptian
rather their
state.
descendants.
And that this is considered so astonishing that many of the French soldiers returning to France after this dress in their fashion, especially the hussars, who are very flamboyantly dressed. These are light cavalrymen. And he wins decisively in Egypt, and then he decides to invade Israel. We shall get to the Israel and these other adventures after this next segment break. Returning from his somewhat successful and somewhat embarrassing adventure in the Far East, in Egypt and Israel, Napoleon comes back to France. The Directory at this point is very weak. They're also very jealous of him. From his point of view, he feels that something has to go. He launches a coup with the help of one of his generals and his brother.
And of course, two of the directors, Sayes and Ducos.
Yes, they think that they're hiring themselves a weapon. They don't realize that they now have a weapon in charge of them.
They really thought. The thing is, they give him as the first consul. They give him a very nice title. The first consul will be consul number 2 and number 3, or actually we are co-equals. You'll be the first consul. You get a much higher salary than we are. Of course, they thought that they will make up the difference with graft. Each of us will get 3/10 of what you get, and you have all executive, and we have all executive power, but only you can actually initiate legislation. And they think that they got themselves a patsy. They think he's a general. He would go somewhere chasing glory on the field of battle, and they would run France and do an embarrassing amount of money doing that. The thing is, Napoleon is a workaholic. Napoleon works from day and night, and he takes his new job very seriously. And he works and he works and he works and he floods the new legislature with ideas which they are more than willing to accept. After all, and one of those ideas is, while the other consuls would serve only 10 years, he would serve for life. Funny how that works.
Although it took him a while to solidify his power, so he's only made. I see in this timeline that he's only made consul for life in 1802.
Yes.
So initially, in 1800, when he fights the Austrians again, this time Marengo, the battle he nearly lost, and he had to dramatize for propaganda purposes. He was, in fact, only controlling the smaller force. The main French force was fighting the Austrians and their German allies along the Rhine. So he had such weak control of the government that he couldn't, in fact, delegate himself the lion's share of the army. But he makes peace with the Austrians in 1802. He's made consul for life. He's fighting again in 1805. Between then, there is relative peace. So between the Battle of Marengo in 1800 and 1805, there's relative peace on land, and in 1804 he's crowned Emperor of the French.
Yes, and there is not really, as far as it goes with the actual constitution of France, there is not much difference between the consulate and the empire. Because in the consulate, as we established, all executive power rests with the three consuls. Only the first consul may initiate legislation. And then here's an interesting thing. Remember how we told you that the National Assembly was the center of French politics by the Constitution of 1793? So the consulate breaks this body apart. They create at least 4 different bodies. The first is the legislative corps, which is the only body that can debate the laws that are initiated and written by the three consuls, by the first consul. But by the way, they can debate them, but they cannot vote on them. That is the job of the tribunal, which is another legislative body whose job is to vote but not to debate. All they do is to look at the transcript from the legislative corps and say, okay, according to those debates, what should we do? Should we affirm this law? Should we pass this law? Or should we not pass this law? And if they don't pass this law, then guess what? The executive just writes another law, pass it through, and the legislative corps debates it, and the tribunal pass it or doesn't pass it. And then you have the Senate, or as Napoleon, or in the official name, le Senat conservateur, the conserving Senate, because what is conserving? Conserving the Constitution. Now, it's basically, the idea was that they would advise the consuls and later the emperor, and also if something is unconstitutional, they would strike it down. The thing is, most of them are appointed by the first consul and emperor, Napoleon Bonaparte, and and those appointed by Bonaparte are co-opting other people from a list that Napoleon created, and this list is called the list of notables, and of notables, and which actually are a separate assembly, an advisory assembly to the emperor, who is so ineffectual and fake and non-important that English newspapers start calling the assembly of not-ables.
Because they're not doing anything. So my impression from what you're saying is Napoleon controls all these.
Exactly. He sits in. He essentially is. He's an absolute monarch, and the more and more. And yes, you're right. At the beginning, he was not that powerful because he was not a very well-known politician. Sieyès and Ducos were doing this stuff since the beginning of the revolution. Napoleon is a young guy. He just came back from campaign. He spent his entire life on the battlefield, and he's not very known. But very soon he takes advantage of his new position and makes himself well known and very popular, and eventually he makes himself emperor. Now we think about emperor and king as almost different in gradation. We think, oh, what is better than being a king? It's being an emperor. But no, emperor in 18th century classically educated France has a whiff of Augustus, which means it's not a ruler that rules by divine grace. It's a ruler and he's not ruling a kingdom as if it was his own domain. No, this is a ruler who rules a republic because the people want him to be there, because for the good of the people, because he's the great man who would lead the republic to new heights of glory and success.
Well, speaking of the people, it should be mentioned this kind of oddity of the French Revolution that you once in a while have these referendums
Oh,
on
yes.
Napoleon becoming consul and becoming emperor. And tell me what sort of scores he's getting. He's winning 99% of the vote on these things. Now,
He wins.
does
Okay.
he put his finger a little bit on the thumb, you might think?
Well, yes, but even before he puts the fingers on the thumb, he actually won. That's the funny thing. When he makes the jump from first consul to emperor, in the plebiscite, he wins the referendum on that questions, with 1.5 million votes for, a few thousands against. Very nice.
Amazing.
But he goes over, and by the way, he is the one. But then the voting rolls come before him, and he changed the number to 3 million. To 3,000,004, because it's more impressive.
So, you're saying he won fair, but he decided to inflate it anyhow to be
Yes,
more
exactly,
impressive.
exactly.
Well, I'm not sure. I do believe I read that the army votes were completely fake because they wouldn't count the soldiers individually. They would only do it by acclamation.
Yes,
So, firstly, you would have to have the courage to vote against Napoleon while you're with your buddies in the same regiment.
yeah, but that's already, but that already gives the lie to the point that it means that in a regiment it was more safe to be for Napoleon than against Napoleon, which means most of the regiments was for Napoleon.
Yeah, yes. But if individuals wanted to vote for him, against him, A, they would have to be brave enough to speak that up, and B, the general who hears the acclamation would have to actually say, oh, this whippersnapper is actually voting against him, let me jot that down. I don't
Yes.
think it was necessarily good for a career
Yes,
to report
exactly.
that bad news.
Exactly,
So,
and at least, and let's
but I think the civilian votes are generally speaking considered much more kosher.
yes, much more kosher in the sense that and the reason he does it, it's not clear why. Maybe his brother who masterminded this entire thing, his little brother thought 3 million sounds better than 1.5 million.
Now, this was one of his successful brothers. He's not renowned for having competent siblings. Joseph, for example, is not well looked at by history.
No,
Who's later became king of Spain, and he lost the kingdom of Spain. Was also put in charge of.
not through any fault of his own.
Oh, that is an interesting question. To briefly talk about that, so Napoleon eventually invades Spain, which is his Vietnam. Or you could say that our Vietnam War is like Napoleon's Spain. That's how bad it was.
Well, we didn't lose our entire army in Vietnam. We actually lost our losses were pretty light. If you look at it historically, we just had televisions, and
So Napoleon's loss in Spain is in part because there's nobody there to coordinate his marshals.
absolutely.
And obviously, you would think the king of Spain would have that job, but he didn't have the authority and the energy and
Joseph is not a
and
soldier.
the will to do it.
And Joseph is a lawyer and a politician. He's not a soldier.
Right. But the thing that that I guess Napoleon maybe unrealistically expected to do, which was to unify command around himself, it was not successfully done. So the various marshals fighting in Spain, unsuccessfully trying to pacify the entire country. For most of the war, they had most of the country in their grip, or at least the highways of the country. As one of Napoleon's generals said, we have as far as our cannons could shoot, because the guerrillas owned the countryside. But the one thing that he could have done was not done.
Yes.
Napoleon himself was present in Spain to the extent that people in France thought that he may be deceased, and the Austrians took advantage of that by thinking that he was in worse straits. So the great peace of Europe that had now been reigning for several years came to an end. Napoleon did a preemptive strike, and he defeated them at Ulm and Austerlitz. He later fought the Prussians as well, defeated them separately. The Russians were on the same side of the Austrians at Austerlitz. They did not do well. Later battles, up to the invasion of Moscow, we won't cover. Napoleon invades Russia. Doesn't go well.
Without provocation, I might say.
Right. Except for in his fantasy of his mind that they weren't adhering to his continental plan. He was trying to economically isolate his bitterest rival, the British, by
Yes.
preventing all of Europe from trading with them.
And guess what? The British trade was so important that what actually happened is that Europe starved and not Britain.
Yes, it also resulted in him having to attack his allies, his erstwhile allies, or neutral countries such as Portugal, for not adhering to his continental plan and not cutting off trade with England. So using that as an excuse, he invades Russia. It's a disaster. We won't go into it. He now has to fight. This is in 1812. In 1813, he fights in Germany. Again, a disaster, in part because he's massively outnumbered by the Allies, who are now arraigned against him. The entirety of Europe had been in a war since the beginning of the French Revolution in 91, 92, and up until 1815. The various groups of countries fighting against France go by their coalitions. First coalition, seventh coalition. By the time that he loses at Leipzig, a great battle, this is the seventh coalition, I believe, or maybe the sixth coalition. I'll have to look into that later. And then he loses in France proper. He's exiled to Elba. He returns for 100 days. He's restored as emperor. He fights off the British and Prussians. He loses at Waterloo, and he gets exiled to the terrible place of St. Helena. That is a very brief summary of Napoleon's career and of the Napoleonic Wars. Question: you mentioned that Napoleon is, when he's using all sorts of legal tricks to take over, does he have a new constitution written?
Actually, when he becomes the emperor the first time around, he keeps the consulate basically the same. It's basically the consulate. Instead of 3 consuls, he have only himself. So, and that's not such a big change, considering that as first consul, he basically did most of the work and got most of the glory anyway. So, what's the difference? So
he did change the constitution from the directory to consul.
Oh yeah, the directory is very different. The directory is tax-paying male Frenchmen vote for the council of the 500, basically the lower house. The lower house chooses from among themselves the assembly of the ancients, basically think of it as a very corrupt senate, and together from themselves the ancients, or the senators, if you want to call it that, choose the 5 directors. So that's a very, very undemocratic regime. Undemocratic in the sense that it's a very retrogression in terms of democracy from the universal suffrage of every Frenchman over 21, and it's an actual business of government conducted by people who are very, very distant from the vote and not very vulnerable to the vote or to the popular vote. You might say that now in the consulate, Napoleon restores the universal male franchise. The differences, the limitations on age and on income are not on the voters as much as on the legislatures and the legislature and the various people holding public office. So we already went through the legislative court, the tribune, the senate, and the notables, and so yeah, you might say that the empire and the consulate were more democratic than the directory, but on the other hand, with all this grand democracy, Napoleon can do whatever he wants.
Which reminds me of a quote that you had. We try to do a quote for every one of our episodes. Your quote is.
He once said to the legislatures, "You were elected by a small constituency. I was elected by France." And on the same vein, and I believe in the same speech, he said, "All authority is in the throne. And what is the throne? This wooden frame covered with velvet? No, I am the throne."
So that's, I think, interesting, both for its drama, for its dramatic effect, but also kind of for it, I think, encapsulating his philosophical approach
yes
to the regime. And one of the things that we're focused on in the podcast, The Iron Rod, is to understand tyranny and
Liberty.
liberty and the effect on government and how that plays out. And that this is definitely a prime example. Do you want to cover anything else on the constitutionalities?
So the constitution. So we went through that. So let's think about it. We went from a constitution which is a centralized unicameral legislature controlling the Republic of France to a government by an extra constitutional body, the Committee of Public Safety, to a constitution that basically removes government from the politics of election, to a constitution that does it again but gives some outlet to the public will to show itself through the elections to the legislature, while all government is actually being done by the emperor and by the emperor and his advisors. So let's think about it. Who is the real tyrant here? Is Napoleon a tyrant? Well, if by tyrant you mean someone who rules alone, yeah, he is a tyrant. If you mean someone who rules by fear, yeah, he rules by fear. And he rules by and by the way, he knows it very well because he recruits, as we said, Fauchet, the butcher of Lyon, to be his minister of police. A man who is not intending of ruling by fear does not hire Fauchet. And so, is he a tyrant in the classical sense? A man who rules by power alone, without regard on justification to any kind without any source of legitimacy outside of himself? No, he can say, no, I rose to power. Yes, I disassembled the old government, but then I asked the people, and we already established that the people are the source of all power. So I asked the people; they wanted to make me first among equals, among my co-equal consuls. Then they want to make me the first consul, the truly first consul. Then they want to make me emperor. I did everything right, and actually, as a matter of fact, I returned to the people a lot of their power. I did, and all I did. Say what you will about me. Yes, I benefit a lot of my family and myself personally, but I benefit the people of France. The people of France, I gave them empire. I won again and again and again. I gave them glory. I gave them victory. Something they haven't known for 3 generations. I did a lot of good. To which Aristotle would say, well, I never say that the tyrant don't do good. As a matter of fact, Thucydides would say, tyrants, as a matter of fact, have a lot of potential for good. They view the state as their own, therefore they try to preserve it. But tyrants have a problem because they don't really have. Because what is really the source of legitimacy? The people. The people gave him legitimacy as their emperor only after he took control over them. So basically, it's a master asking his slave, would you like to continue to be my slave? After the slave spent years upon years in servitude, and after the master bought him from another master who treated him worse. I won't say that what the slaves say, that the slave's consent to be a slave at this point matters very much. The slave is not capable at this point to accept servitude, and besides, I believe that nobody is capable of consent to servitude. Servitude is especially when your entire ideal is to create a free society. In a free society, nobody should be able to consent to servitude. That's the one thing you are not allowed to consent to, and therefore, and leaving this alone, because Napoleon did not become consul and emperor because the people forced him to. He was not a George Washington. As a matter of fact, he made reference in passing to George Washington, and he said that he can't understand George Washington. That George Washington passed on the opportunity to create the greatest country in the world. Well, interesting, yes. But the point is that he was not called to service by the people or by their plight or by his higher qualities. He imposed upon the people his service. He pressed the people to his service, and therefore evil consequences must follow.
Yes, and evil they were. Of course, the Napoleonic Wars unleashed tremendous bloodshed in Europe. Maybe 1 million or 2 million.
Even if you look
died.
just from if you care only about France, France was drained from her lifeblood.
Yes.
And France, and ever since then, the French, who before the revolution have one of the most ancient regimes on the continent, never again had a stable government.
Yes. So France's history since then has been unstable. I think that is a good characterization. Although it is hard to fathom any other scenario playing itself out, really, after the revolution and the instability and the Jacobins and the Directory, that would lead to anything almost as stable as Napoleon. And Napoleon in 1802, 1803 was sovereign over tremendously stable France. It's hard to imagine any other government defeating their enemies decisively enough to create peace long enough. But I think we will have to continue this conversation another time because we still have to do our movie quote. And this week, our movie recommendation. This week, the movie recommendation comes from Isaac.
Well, it's not necessarily speaking a movie. It's actually, I'm cheating here because it's a made for French television miniseries called Napoleon from 2002. Don't worry, there's an English dub available on YouTube and other sources, as you may. And it's actually, the dub is also very well executed, very well played. Napoleon cuts actually a very attractive character, and not just because I'm not just mean that he's played by an actor that looks very, very well and actually looks a lot like him.
Yes.
So I
have seen this. I'm not going to guarantee that I will see every single movie recommendation because we'll be covering a lot of history, and we will try to, like I said in the beginning of the program, we will try to tie in our movie recommendations and book recommendations and so on to the theme. Which might be a bit tricky in ancient times.
But Napoleon actually appeared very sympathetic in this, and the show, which is compressed on YouTube to 4 parts, is actually portraying does not paper over his mistakes and his error and his actual bad qualities, and of course the bad qualities of his family, which were numerous, but he does portray him as a somewhat sympathetic character. And
well, speaking of Napoleon art, we will have to do the other Isaac's art recommendation will have to be done next time when we talk about the 2 famous portraits of Napoleon crossing the Alps in greater detail, because I feel like we need to spend more time on it to make that recommendation. So instead, I'm going to cheat. This was not in the show notes. I'm going to recommend Tchaikovsky's 1812.
The only symphony which have an actual cannon shooting in it.
An actual cannon shooting in it. So if that's not enough to convince you, I don't know what will. And I think we have those. We had the book recommendation earlier. Thank you, Isaac, for the quote. Did we bust any myths in today's podcast, would you say?
Well, did we? Well, I think we bust the myth that the National Assembly controlled France during the terror. We bust the myth that Napoleon was a sincere anti-Jacobinist, anti-Jacobin, because, as we know, first of all, after the Reign of Terror, nobody is left in France who is not either a Jacobin or a royalist. The moderates are all dead, and the
occupational hazard
are all dead or fled. So basically, everybody that rules France during the Directory is an ex-Jacobin, is a Jacobin in retirement who was not just trying to make as much money as possible.
So let me add, and on this we will close, our dear listeners, that it's hilarious that the Jacobins are reviled with good reason as being the most extreme, the most tyrannical, the most bloodthirsty, the most eager to use the guillotine. And initially, they were in some ways moderate. I mean, they were a book club and they had their ideas, but they were in fact against the imprisonment of the king. They were against the execution. And they, radicalized over time. So that's an interesting lesson about how a so-called moderate group, they were infiltrated by various people, Robespierre among them, and they became the monster that they are.
And ironically, they were continuing, as we said, the royal project of Louis XIV. And maybe that should be the topic of our next episode.
Yeah, so we haven't set this in stone, or, iron rod style, because we are a free society among the two co-hosts here.
Yeah,
but we may do Napoleon again as early as next week for our next episode. We will definitely come back to Napoleon. We haven't begun to talk about all the exciting things there is to say: politics, philosophy, art, jurisprudence, his great codes, and of course his great wars. The Britannica says that he is the greatest strategist to ever live. We will have to put that in test.
Which Benjamin Littleheart would dispute, because in his opinion, Scipio is greater than Napoleon. He actually made this the title of his book.
Right, and we will also get back to Scipio Africanus in the future as well. Thanks so much, dear listener.
Thank you, Joseph.
Thank you, Isaac.
It was a pleasure.